Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Wall, a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And thank you all for attending the Culture and Contemporary Life talk series. This series is an initiative of the culture section of the American Sociological Association. And the purpose of this series is to explore the pressing social issues of our time through a cultural lens and examine how cultural sociology can inform these issues. And we'll be having panels throughout the academic year. So each panel will be a discussion among several speakers and a moderator, all of whom are experts in the area. The discussion will be followed by a Q&A. And to participate in the Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A chat at any time during or after the discussion. And this session is on the culture of poverty myth and anti-Blackness in the 21st century. And our panelists will be Jean Beaman, who's an associate professor in sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Monica Bell, who's an associate professor of law and sociology at Yale University, and Alford Young Jr., who's a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. And we'll have Jordanna Matlon, who is an assistant professor in the School of International Service at American University, moderating this discussion. So I'm going to turn this over now to Jordanna to get the discussion started. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thank you to the discussants for sharing this space with me, and to the American Sociological Association section on culture for hosting this great conversation. So I'd like to start with asking, why are we here? Why do we keep having this conversation? Why do we keep coming back, both in popular discourse and in academic discourse, to this idea of the culture of poverty thesis on Blackness in America? And I'm agnostic about who to start with, so I'm just going to say, Monica, if we can start with you, but this question is directed at everyone.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. It's a huge question. And I think it's important to consider its roots in terms of, especially in the US context, but really globally, in thinking about how we have justified and created institutions like enslavement, imperialism, and settler colonialism. And all of this is part of why we've arrived at race itself, and then a bundle of justifications that attach to race. So historically, there have been two major kind of sets of justifications about racialization, biology and culture, roughly speaking. And sociology has been quite complicit in the development of biological analyses of the meaning of race. If we think about our roots with respect to eugenics, the first issue of the American Journal of Sociology, major article on eugenics published there. But alongside that biology justification has been consistently a cultural justification and a set of explanations that are rooted in kind of racialized notions of a culture to justify continuing inequality and hierarchy and oppression. So if we bundle that in the US context, along with American ideas of individualism, and the kind of idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps and an inattention to structural justifications and structural dynamics. And also we have a hard time seeing people in collectivity. So all of these notions, like these ideologies of individualism, our justifications for institutions of racial oppression, all of this helps justify cultural explanations for inequality.
Thank you for that. Jean, would you like to pick up on that?
Sure. First, I just want to thank Hannah and the ASA Culture section for putting this together. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you, be virtually here. I'm glad I'm in California, not elsewhere in the country. But anyway, so yeah, I completely echo everything Monica said. I would just add 2 points. One of the reasons, or 2 reasons why I think we're continually coming back to this point. One is that I think, at least in the United States, if not globally, we have this general understanding of a forward racial progress, right? So we always imagine that the conditions of Black Americans, Black peoples around the world are infinitely better than they were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 2000 years ago, et cetera, right? And so the idea that there could still be this concept of Black struggle is antithetical to people's understanding of, everyone's free, I'm being glib on purpose. And the second thing I would add, just to kind of echo on what I already said, is I think there's generally a lack of acknowledgement or broader recognition of the heterogeneity of Black life, right? And so there's a way in which, and this sort of also is piggybacking on what Monica said, there's a way in which we continually flatten who Black people are, both again in the United States and globally. And so I think that's partly why we keep coming back to these very old, tired tropes of a culture of poverty myth.
Thanks so much. Al?
Thank you as well for this opportunity. And I will follow along the stream of expression of my colleagues and point to some particular dynamics that I think are critical to what's going on. The simple answer to your question, at least as far as the United States is concerned and African Americans, from my point of view, is that despite transformations in technology that bring us in some sense closer to each other, whether it's via airplane travel versus the horse and buggy, or technology that creates visual images, despite different patterns of geographic mobility that folks of color, African Americans in particular, have experienced, there is still tremendous social distance between many Black Americans and everybody else. And I think that, along with the larger macro dynamics that my colleagues have touched upon, speaks to why these problems endure. We are not nearly as engaged with each other. Indeed, there is not nearly as much toleration of difference as there should be, despite the appearance of connection, given the moment we're living in.
Thank you. So I actually had a follow-up question that I was thinking for you, Al, given your long history writing about issues that speak to these topics, but certainly I would invite the other participants to answer as well. And that's thinking about the historical or theoretical origins, if you could explain to a lay audience, of the culture of poverty myth. So certainly Monica raised the first AJS issue, having eugenics, but then there's also that story, that legacy, right, of the culture of poverty. So if you could possibly enlighten us a little bit about that.
Certainly, and I'm going to go back at least 50 years before the culture of poverty as a concept garnered great purchase in American discourse. And I'm going to talk about the abolitionist era and the end of slavery, where at that moment, one of 2 critical cultural perspectives on African Americans, particularly low-income African Americans, emerged. And they're contradictory, but I think powerful and enduring over the 20th century. The first, and tied to the commitment to regulate Black bodies, the emergence of Jim Crow legislation following Reconstruction, was the public discourse that Black people had to be compelled to work responsibly, to go to work. Right? So aside from these explicit arguments about why and how should we maintain control of Black bodies, well, they don't adapt to the industrial order. These bodies need to be managed, right? They'll be lazy if not for intervention, right? Flies against several hundred years of history of Black folks as slaves working harder than anybody else in the United States. But the very notion of the lazy Black American in public discourse is grounded in that moment. Fast forward now to more than 50 years later, and in urban America in the 60s, in particular, you have the rise of large-scale riots, activities that are tied to frustration with the pace of the civil rights movement. And so mainstream America is confronted with aggression, hostility, the kind of agency that scares people. Those are the contradictory forces that I see that come together and how notions of the culture of poverty endure. African Americans, particularly of low income status, are seen as either highly agentic in that they are angry, aggressive, and hence threatening, or not agentic at all, lazy, unwilling to do the right things. And both of those perspectives emerge, as contradictory as they are, both emerge in the perseverance of a cultural poverty logic around these people.
Thank you. Would either of the other speakers like to jump in? Okay, thanks. So I have a question, Monica. If you could tie in maybe some of your scholarship, and you mentioned that, you know, one of the first things you said was the role of institutions in your first response. Could you speak a little bit about the role institutions play in producing and perpetuating Black poverty? And I would love to hear maybe you share some kind of your insights from your own scholarship.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. So, you know, as someone who studies both law and the sociology of culture, the basic demand is to really examine institutions and the role they play and the, kind of our architecture around them. So, you know, primarily, I think institutions serve the purpose of protecting status quo distributions of status, power, and wealth, right? That's like, you know, institutions basically serve those functions. And in order to do so, they do work that is both material, but they also do a lot of work that is cultural and ideological in terms of constructing how people view the world. So through the notions of cultural sociology, you might think about those as frames, or any other number of cultural tools that inform how people therefore further engage with institutions. So there are multiple ways in which, I've talked about this in my work. One of them is through how people see neighborhoods, neighborhoods where they would like to live or not. And I've particularly in many ways focused on policing and the institutions of police departments as being an institution that does cultural work at a kind of macro and meso level. We tend not to think about policing in that way. We focus on the physical violence of policing without focusing so much on the symbolic violence of policing or how policing helps, even marginalized people, and by helps, I mean constructs, like creates, even marginalized people shapes how we therefore further engage. This has also been true in some work I've done on legal estrangement and other sorts of dynamics. So it's important, I think, to shed light on that type of cultural work that institutions play. And it reinforces poverty, I'd say, in part because of these, this example of where people choose to live or where people feel constrained toward living. So there's a way in which some places to live, some places to work, some ways of moving about the world are withheld, not just through the material work that institutions play, but also through these lenses, these narratives, these kind of these cultural tools that infect people, like in general, and shape who they think belongs in what place or not, and constructs boundaries, to draw on some of Michelle Lamont's work, for example. So,
thank you. I'm always going to direct a question at one person, but I would invite others to respond as well, or when I direct it at one person. Would either of you like to pipe in about the role of institutions, Jean or Al?
I'll jump in very briefly and say, and I think this is a critical moment for perhaps more enriched, more advanced conversations for the kinds of folks that are in our audience today. When we think about formal institutions, schools, workplaces, social service agencies, all of those are sites where the response to Black bodies, the effort to regulate Black bodies, the surveillance of Black bodies happen in similar fashion. Given our divides in the discipline, we may not always come together to have these conversations. The schooling sociologists over here and the work and occupation over there and what have you. But there's a real opportunity for us to think about how the same patterns of regulation, surveillance, disqualification from access to these formal spaces happens, across these very different institutional settings, but speaks to, the larger issue of what's at stake we're talking about today.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, and your point about the police, Monica, and how so often we think about the physical violence. Certainly, having the talk, right? Certain relationships, certain dispositions. If you want to take a Bourdieusian, right, perspective, these are changing the way, if you want to call it culture, right? People react. Yeah. Jean?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, kind of going back to what I really like that Al brought up earlier, is the question of agency in all of these discussions, right? And so thinking about not just, Black Americans or Black people more generally as sort of problems to be solved, quote unquote, but rather thinking through how they agentically respond to the structural problems that they face. And so I think I've been really encouraged by work by, Marcus Hunter, Andrea Robinson, Orly Clerget, who's really sort of examined issues of agency from this perspective, which I think is fruitful here.
Thanks so much. So I want to follow up with a question for Eugene okay, I'm not.
Yeah.
So I thought I was on silence for a minute. So thinking about your work in France, and definitely the role of culture and the way culture is used to talk about race, I think that it would be a great opportunity to kind of enlighten maybe the more Amerocentric sociologists. And it's something I'm always thinking about when I hear about the culture of poverty myth. I'm like, you got to look at France. You got to look at France. So if you could speak a little bit about what a comparative lens adds to this conversation, and thinking particularly the French racist culture framework.
Yeah, happy to. That can speak all day about France, so you'll have to stop me. So yeah, I mean, I think again, it's really interesting to think about this in a comparative framework, and I think France is particularly interesting because of its disavow of race as a category and a sort of disavow of talking about race or sort of discourse about race. And of course, we can have a conversation about how much discourse around race in the U.S. actually happens, but nonetheless. But the structure of French republicanism as an ideology, is both a structure, but it also provides a particular cultural repertoire in which all difference is framed as cultural and not racial, right? And so this is sort of why we can understand various recent phenomena such as the panic of the multiculturalism in France, the panic of the presence of Muslims, and sort of the panic or fear of what the presence of French Muslims is doing to French culture, and also to sort of unpack the ways that through France's colonial history, which is only ended up until very, very recently, France culture, French identity has been framed very purposefully as homogeneously white, right? And so you're able to have a conversation about what is French identity or what is French culture without talking about race, but it's very clear that it's undergirded by particular racial ethnic underpinnings. So I think, culture, both literally and figuratively in France, does a lot of work to sort of put forth a very purposeful monolithic version of its present identity, but also a very particular monolithic version of its history, right? And so then you hear a lot of these conversations about how migration is a relatively recent phenomena, even though France has a very long history of migration, primarily from its former French colonies, but nonetheless. Right, and so I think culture does a lot of work to sort of flatten representations, both literally and figuratively, of what France is, of who French people can be, and this, among other reasons, is why racial and ethnic minorities in France are continually excluded and marginalized because they're not white, and they're therefore not seen as being able to be seen as French, even if they see themselves as French.
Thank you. So, extending that, if much of your discussion just now was within the French context, how can we bring this to insight into the American anti-Blackness and the culture of poverty thesis to kind of nuance this conversation, or maybe speak to my first question, the popular as well as the academic discourse? Is there a way that it can enrich the American context?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of thinking about France and bringing it back to the United States sort of gives us insights onto the work that using culture does when we're actually talking about race. So I think, in other words, it gives us a sense of understanding these kind of code words that we're using to talk about racial difference by not actually talking about racial difference. So when we talk about sort of African-American culture or Black culture, what are we actually saying, right? And how are we sort of locating, in this case, Black Americans as outside of mainstream America? And I think, because this is very purposely done in France, I think it gives us insights to how this is sort of more maybe discreetly done here in the United States.
And not to pick on you, but okay, what about the American conversation on race? Going back into France, is there some nuance that would be helpful for using these categories or these frameworks? And I certainly think about, for example, Trump's recent, and he's no longer, but this anti-critical race theory and these prohibitions. And when I read that, I said, well, that's France. So are there ways that actually the US conversation might enrich elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a tricky question because I think there's sort of the, what is the US conversation versus what is the French perception of the US conversation, right? And so there's always this like ongoing discourse. I mean, there was just a piece in the New York Times, I believe last week, about sort of the fear in French academia or French intellectual circles of sort of the encroaching of American ideas of critical race theory, of the existence of racism, et cetera, et cetera. And that, is, I think, often framed as recent, but it's actually just a current manifestation of this like ongoing paranoia of anything in France becoming anything like the United States, right? And so that's more a question of sort of a portrayal or perception of what's happening in the United States. But sort of on a more factual level, I think that what is revealed is sort of how colorblind frameworks are ineffective and don't work, right? And so I think that ultimately is one of the things that really scares French people, both in the academy and not. And so to sort of have, research done in the United States or research done by non-French people that shows that, that is automatically going to be seen as a danger.
So then we're dealing more with an institutional, right, and the elitism. So Monica, you had mentioned when you had started speaking about the role of institutions, you had started off with this is a global history, right? This is a history of imperialism, of slavery, of colonialism. So is there something you would like to add to kind of a larger lens, and if there is some kind of enriching of or adding nuance if we think outside of the N=1 case of the US?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for us to think outside the N=1 of the US context, even as someone who mostly writes about the US context. And that's because, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I noticed a question in the Q&A about what does anti-Blackness even mean? And I think that question is really important for why we need to have a global lens, because in the US context, maybe less right now, but certainly over recent decades, we've had an understanding of anti-Blackness that has to do with like failures to integrate or like failures to recognize certain people's rights, and this kind of really Americanist concept of what racial justice looks like, which in the US context, although not exclusively, if we look at the Black Power movement, nationalism, et cetera, but there's been a lot of focus on assimilation, integration as being the vision of what it would mean to overcome anti-Blackness, or really to overcome racial injustice. But if we really understand the context of imperialism, settler colonialism, and enslavement, like all these macro structural processes and how they cut across many different groups of Black people across the globe, and also create additional racial categories. So, I mean, this might sound pretty random, but I spent some time in Ireland, and one of the most interesting constructions of race in Ireland was the construction of travelers, travelers as a racial group. And when I couldn't tell the difference from a phenotypical level between Irish and traveler or settled person, or I couldn't tell the difference. And I think it just underscores how the creation of race, and particularly the construction of Blackness, is about macro historical dynamics. And what we do as cultural sociologists is to understand the reproduction of those cultural and historical dynamics, and how they are continually reinforced, and also their impacts. And of course, we have to pay attention to agency. Like, I'm not so much of a structuralist that I don't care about agency, but the point is that the context, like what anti-Blackness means, is not individualistic or small group level construction of boundaries in that way. As part of it, though, we can't overlook that, but the broader context is far more structural. So that's what I was trying to allude to, and that's at least my conception of what anti-Blackness is.
Thank you so much. Al, would you like to pick up on any of that?
Yeah, I will add a slightly nuanced perspective on anti-Blackness. And I think what's important about that term is it enables scholars, lay people, to avoid reducing the focus on the importance of race to explicit acts of racism. They certainly matter, right? Violating Black bodies, racism, that all matters. But there's a way in which anti-Blackness, the very term, how it gets implicated in analytical approaches, helps us make sense of what goes on when Black folks aren't in spaces. How institutional dynamics, social processes unfold that don't take into account the alternative ways in which at least some Black Americans may respond. Right? And so anti-Blackness happens in the absence of Black people being around as much as it does with their presence. And I find it a crucial term to help broaden our consideration of the meaningfulness behind race and Blackness in particular, that gets lost sometimes in the language and lexicon that drives the focus on particular acts or particular events.
Thank you for that. That actually segues nicely to a question I would like to direct at you, Al. So, you know, we're thinking about anti-Blackness, but also certainly one of the most important innovations in thinking about issues of the isms and just bias, right, and discrimination is intersectionality. So is there a way that thinking about the race gender intersectional lens, but we could also think about sexuality, certainly the other axes of identity would help us understand some of the questions we're talking about, certainly anti-Blackness even, right? But also thinking about the way the culture of poverty and the differentiation and the distance you spoke about earlier is maintained, is created using these other tropes and other vectors of identity.
I certainly think it opens up necessary and important ways of broadening conversation. One of the great negative consequences, I think, of studying race and studying African Americans is that too often, not so much the producers of the scholarship, but the audiences really pigeonhole or bracket these kinds of inquiries and assume they all fit together in some nice, neat box called race and ethnic studies, or whatever the language might be, that creates artificial and maybe false boundaries for inquiry. Intersectionality enables us to think more deeply and creatively about how African Americans as people, discourses around anti-Blackness, other perspectives that have to do with the study of the experiences of Black folks and the consequences of how they live their lives, reflect great patterns of diversity, difference. Right? All the while, Blackness and some notion of the African American experience looms large. So for me, and there's still great work to be done, I think we realize these possibilities. I think in the discipline and academia more generally, we've been able to grapple with the kind of stability and consistency of race, of some notion of Blackness, while we see difference across gender dynamics, sexual orientation, what have you. But we're not yet at the point of producing as rich and varied a kind of empirical tradition. And that's okay, right? There's work to be done, and there's lots of us that can do it. But to me, that's the next step. And there's so many ways, even around a culture of poverty, that we can make this come alive, right? The gender divide is critical and I think well recognized, although in some ways still under-researched, right? How it is that Black bodies across different gender categories engage each other, respond to each other, or responded to in the broader context. And that there's still bracketed sort of studies that don't allow a more wholesome conversation. The terrain of intersectionality looms large in so many other ways. I've recently begun studying small city African-American poverty. And what happens in a city of 30,000 people has great similarities, but great differences in a city of 1 million. And getting that kind of conversation launched and incorporated. We've got great work to do that allows us, on the one hand, embrace notions of difference, distinction, particularity, but commonality and how race and Blackness matters.
Thank you. So important. And I would say that you're certainly somebody who's been leading the way in some of these conversations. So might you share a little bit about your scholarship, for example, on men and masculinity, to the audience to think about how you've kind of deepened these kinds of analyses?
Certainly. And I will say, I think aside from doing the work that I do, a rather later realization, within the past decade, is thinking about the audiences you share it with. So that, I have historically studied African American men. I have only within the last several years done substantive work. In fact, my work on small city African Americans focused on men and women. But, almost for 20 years, I was a Black man studying Black men, and that was it. But there were moments of encountering scholars who do Black feminist thought, who think deeply about Black men too, right? And there may be particular questions that are different, but think deeply about Black men that one wouldn't imagine, certainly I didn't early in my career, the importance of engaging that audience. And it's not simply to share empirical insights, it's to think deeply about theory. Black feminist theory speaks to Black men in powerful ways. It speaks to a masculinist theory, if I can call it as such, in ways that still needs to unfold, still needs to advance. But that very possibility comes out of engaging that audience. The very ways in which we think about Black male bodies in space and time gets enriched through comparative thought about the work that people have done on women, as far as heterosexuality is concerned, what some people have done around gay lesbian community, right? There are all these capacities to really deepen your approach to your own population that necessarily comes out of engaging these other audiences. I'm still new at that. I think the discipline is still new at that, but it's an inherently important project to pursue.
Thanks so much. Monica, I would certainly imagine there's a strong gender dimension that comes out when you do your field work, and whether or not it's the subjectivity of you as a researcher or the things that you're seeing, but would you care to comment on some of that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I was actually thinking, and this has a lot to do with my teaching, actually, but the role of anti-Blackness in queer spaces has been really important. So I appreciated your question, because I think often when people talk about intersectionality, it's like, oh, I guess we're going to talk about Black women now, like Black cishet women. Like, it's like, okay, it's time for you to be discussed. But a lot of the work on intersectionality is increasingly looking at just other notions of intersection. So it's not about intersectional identities, but intersectional spaces of power. And there's been a way in which, especially as we've broadened our understanding of our understanding of gender identity in general. Also, as there have been changes in the power situation of a group that we might collectively refer to as LGBTQ, right? Like, so, it's, with changes in like marriage equality, these sorts of changes mean that there is greater bifurcation in the power situation of people in the queer community than there used to be. And what that means is it's a fruitful place for studying anti-Blackness and identifying it and looking at its specific dimensions in a space of shifting marginality and marginalization. So that's just one example, but in some of my own work, I've studied specifically Black women and in some work. And one of the things that has been really important there is, this is actually, I've really learned a lot from Al's work about this, where not making assumptions because of shared identity. There's a way in which it can be difficult, I think, to get a full picture of people's agency in their cultural situation. And, because so many assumptions are made because of our shared structural, not completely shared structural situation, right? But like certain aspects of it. And so I think there's something to be said, not just about intersectionality as like a set of theories that we import into our scholarship, and it also influences how we disseminate our scholarship, but also how we conduct it ourselves. That all of this conversation certainly illuminates. And also just the final footnote to that, because I know I might be talking too much, but this is really salient in the context of culture of poverty and how we arrive at this that notion in sociology, which is a failure to examine intersections and to reflect on one's positionality when interpreting a set of data. And that, I think, like the run to culture in some ways has to do, and the particular, like the culture of poverty myth, I don't want to say it's all cultural sociology, obviously, but that run can emerge out of a failure to see like the full structural dynamics that are shaping cultural situations that we might want to think of as cultural. So I'll stop there, but it's a great question.
Thank you. There's so many things. My head is turning a mile a minute, but I want to open it up to Jean if she'd like to add anything first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I completely agree with what my co-panelist said. I would just add what Monica just ended on, this point around sort of our shared identity in doing this work, particularly as qualitative researchers, as ethnographers. And so that's something that's very present for me, studying a racialized population in a different context and the ways in which, my interlocutors see me as also as a racial ethnic minority, because I am, but also identifying the differences that we're under, or the different structures that we're under, because I'm a US citizen and they are French citizens, right? So I think it's also another way of thinking about intersectionality and thinking about the ways in which our interlocutors identify with us and make similarities and differences between their own social locations or their own experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, just, the comment, one of the comments that Al left with was the big city versus the smaller city, and differences that are beyond the vectors of the major, right? The race, the gender, the sexuality, the religion, perhaps the nation. Who is this we is different for the interlocutors than the audience we're writing for, right? Then even the IRB, who says, oh yeah, there's, has an idea of commonality that might not be. And certainly even just having a doctorate, right? I mean, that often shifts depending on who we're studying, right? So, and something that Monica was saying about, power relations being so important, I really liked that, because is so often, I think, intersectionality is thought of as right, that identity politics, that dirty word, as opposed to understanding power dynamics. And Al had commented about anti-Blackness being kind of understanding outside of the bodies themselves, right? So thinking about these power relations. So to stay on this question for just a moment longer, can we bring that back? Because I think we've spoken a lot about intersectionality and anti-Blackness. And then we've spoken a little bit about culture of poverty as far as, the people that we're studying, but thinking about that myth of difference, right? And how intersectionality complicates, or it's actually something that helps us understand where the differences were located. If that makes sense, how that culture of poverty thesis was created. And I'm certainly thinking, about, like a classic like Elliot Liebau and the role of men and marriageability or things like that. And how these culturally, yeah, I mean, that's it, right? Of not marrying, these kinds of classic tropes about Black men. Is there somewhere that we could expand about that? And certainly, Patricia Collins as a Black feminist scholar about womanhood and tropes of womanhood. So how does that either complicate, or how has that been used to actually further a racial myth? But it's not actually, the origins are not racial. In creating these ideas of difference is what I want to ask. And to anyone.
I mean, it's a really rich question, and so like I'm hesitant to wade too far, but I'll kick us off and let Al and Jean say smarter things. I mean, so there is, so in the US context in particular, so I think this is where I want to be specific about the US. Part of the reason ideas about culture of poverty flow into racial narratives is because we live in a place that is obsessed with racial categories and justifying those, like the existence of racial hierarchy. So it's interesting to even like if we think about the title of this panel is the culture of poverty, myth, and anti-Blackness, because we know that the culture of poverty myth is about Black people. Like, even though we're talking about poverty, which is not a Black phenomenon, and we like this is it, right? I mean, and it's very real. I think that framing is a real framing based on like our experience. So because at the same time that the US is obsessed with racial categories, there is also a simultaneous obsession with the idea of racial progress. This is what Jean talked about at the very beginning. And so if you want to justify a lack of full racial progress, the continued oppression, the wealth disparities, the education disparities, if you want to justify all of that, ideas of cultural poverty are really effective at doing so. And it keeps us from seeing the legacies of structural dynamics. So that's like the beginning of an answer to your really rich question, but I'll let others take it away from here.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll jump in, and I appreciate Monica saying what she did, which made things much more clear for me to be able to be very brief and what I want to offer to this. It comes down to me. I'm going to take a small part of this, or at least what Monica said frames to be a very small part of this, which has to do with how we imagine these notions of cultural particularity, right? And again, the cultural poverty really being about Black people, right? What drives that kind of focus and what we as scholars can do around that. In much the same way. By that, I mean that aside from the 20, 30-year debate, now it's not even really debate anymore, right? From Lebeau to William Julius Wilson, we've heard that people share the same values, right? They want the good life, they want what have you, right? There's so many other cultural properties that still remain for us to unpack and think about that actually position Black folks struggling with poverty as very similar to other people. All the language that's come about in the last 2 or so decades, cultural framing, cultural repertoires, all those point to cultural cognitive elements and dynamics that we all engage and how we make meaning of the world we're in. And the challenge is, and I certainly wouldn't put it upon us simply as scholars, because the audience has a role around this too, is to accept the fact that cultural complexity in this way runs across class categories, runs across race categories. We certainly can't exclude the Black poor from being meaning makers in the way that other folks are. The meanings they make may be slightly different. The ways in which they respond to institutions may be different. The quest they have for survival, not simply the acquisition of status, means there's some differences. But we've got the tools now to really think about a more analytical level playing field and how we try to explore things cultural. And I would hope that the 21st century story for work in the tradition tries to advance that.
Thank you. Thank you for that insightful response, both Monica and Al. And I didn't really give Gina a chance to answer the question, but we are now approaching time, and I had one more question. So maybe if we could use it as kind of a closing remarks kind of question, and then we can go into the Q&A, and it dovetails nicely with what you had just said, Al. So often and I feel like that might be a social 101, not for us who are having this conversation, but there still tends to be like a culture versus structure, or as Monica said, right, the agency versus structure, or the culture versus the institution. And I actually really like, Monica, when you responded to my question, you didn't say, well, you know, this is just about, we have to understand institutions and then explaining the way institutions work, but actually you went into the cultural aspect of institutions. I really appreciated that. So can we kind of like some thoughts about, is it culture versus structure? Is there a better way that we can talk about this, certainly as we introduce these ideas? And I know that it's not culture versus structure. I guess the question is, how can we better say this in a way that's quite concise to be able to have to think about these dynamics?
I can start. Yeah, so, and also just kind of pick up a bit on an earlier thread. So one way I think it's helpful to think about this, and I wanted to bring this up at some point in the discussion, is sort of the role of academia or the academy in sort of furthering some of these discussions, right? So because I think, we can think about sort of, for example, the boundaries around what is sociology of culture or cultural sociology versus what is sociology of race and ethnicity, or whatever it's called these days. And so in the ways in which, like, I think a lot of the work that is needed needs to come across these subfields. I think some of the people on this call have already done, or on this panel are already doing that. But I think that that's partly the issue of why we keep having this culture versus structure, is because we're not sufficiently engaging with the questions and the assumptions in other subfields. So another way of thinking about this, another subfield that I engage with, is sociology of migration, which I think has been really, which is for many years been very divorced from sociology of race and racism. But hope in recent decades, and I hope I'm part of this category, people have brought these two subfields together to think about, we can't just talk about issues of immigrant assimilation or adaptation without understanding what people are being expected to assimilate into. What are the racial structures, the racial hierarchies that people are being able to assimilate into? So again, I think that, like, thinking across these sort of very traditional boundaries or subfield boundaries would be really fruitful to getting to this.
Monica or Al, sorry.
You want to go ahead?
Al, go for it.
So I'll say briefly, there's so much to that question that as I've been saying, a lot today. We'll take a small slice of this. I think we all get that it's not structure versus culture. I think we need to think more carefully about how in our empirical work, how in our analytical work, we're interweaving the two, or why we might privilege one versus the other. As I answer this question, I'm thinking about a comment in the Q&A about Jeffrey Alexander's work and the effort to sort of, pull away from explicit reference to culture and talk about explicit reference to structure and talk about the power of culture. And I understand that to the extent that, what I said earlier about our being similar cultural actors in making meaning, right? And employing repertoires and constructing frames, right? That analytical project is divorced from structure in the sense that there's some deeper, some fundamental issues to explore about how individuals process reality. And they do it wherever they are, meaning that whatever structural arrangements ground you or situate you, there are these cultural dynamics that are unfolding. I accept and appreciate an autonomy, an analytical autonomy around culture for those reasons. But I think that still leaves us with the space to think deeply about how structure bears upon the readings of reality that we have. And I'm not going to give a whole lot of examples. Again, I thought the question could take all day to respond. But even in my space in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right, as I think about walking my son's dog, right, the way I encounter community is entirely different than the way that I did as a child in East Harlem in New York City. Just the very act of walking on the street means engaging structural arrangements, mundane, quotidian, but in very different ways. I don't think there's a dangerous block before me in Ann Arbor. I don't look at people the same way or expect them to look at me in the same way. Some ways positively, some ways negatively. I'm one of the few African Americans in my neighborhood. So there are risks to doing that, right? But it means that structure in those quotidian ways plays a critical role in how I navigate something as mundane as walking a dog. And I walked the dog as a child in East Harlem, right? So very clearly do draw upon contrast. So it means that, structure endures in our imagination, structure endures in our practical realities. There's a lot of work for us to do to think about that more deeply and more thoroughly, given that we accept that the cultural terrain, the structural terrain are always in play in our empirical work.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, so Al said much of what I would have liked to say much more eloquently. So I'm gonna pick up a couple additional points. And I was also gonna kind of address this Jeff Alexander, Phil Smith question. So one of the big problems, I think, in spaces where we focus on cultural sociology is there's a tendency to try to justify our work. There's and the justification has to focus on the specific work culture does, but we have to be a little bit more serious about the work culture does. Like culture, and I think having a strong emphasis. I mean, I think culture matters. I think culture guides action. Like sort of, I wouldn't study culture if I didn't think so, but I do think there are interpretive issues with a lot of cultural sociology that where we just sort of stop with our data and like with the specific theories we're engaging with, instead of broadening out and thinking about what structural dynamics might be at play here to help the reader better interpret the information they're consuming. So why do I think this is important? So I think culture has an independent and analytical independence, but I don't actually buy the idea that culture is truly an autonomous structure. I don't believe that. So I think there are differences of opinion on that question. And I think this is especially true. Like, I think we have to be context specific. This is especially true when talking about poverty, perhaps obviously, because there's a material condition, and also race, because race is guided by materiality if you care about or agree with notions of racial capitalism. And so understanding that context specificity, but then also, I mean, this is maybe more of this is a little bit more of an uncomfortable thing to say, to kind of be my closing remark. But there's also, like, in the US context in particular, but not exclusively, there is such a willingness. We spend a lot of our time talking about the willingness to take up notions of culture of poverty, take up the culture of poverty myth and use it to justify racial injustice that continues and operate in this anti-Black way. So to focus on culture and to pretend that it is autonomous in the context of race and poverty is syncing up with a particular sort of political project, in my opinion. And I know we like to think that, our work is apolitical and there's neutrality attached to it, but there's really not, right? So, I mean, I think that's something we can learn from a lot of cultural sociology, actually. And so for me, with my commitments, I want to think about how my work is going to be interpreted and what type of narrative I'm playing into at a macro level. So that's actually why I started with the macro structural, even though that's not, in fact, what I study. It's the context of what I do. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. And also, I lost my manners, even though I'm from the South. It's like I'm a very bad Southerner, and just also wanted to express gratitude for being a part of this conversation. I'm so honored to be engaging with all of you.
Thank you so much. Those were really great points, and just kind of ending with the bringing up culture of poverty is culture of materiality, right? Culture of, I think that was a really important reminder. So there are actually two questions that, or questions from separate people that speak nicely to what you had said, and I'm going to read them both. So it's going to be more than two questions, but they're related, and I'd like to give you a choice of what to respond to. So the first set of questions is, The history of the culture of poverty narrative seems to have scared a lot of race scholars from the study of culture, and even leads to some discouraging students from studying culture. How can we overcome that? Relatedly, how do you personally approach studying culture given this racist history? And I do think that you spoke a little bit to this, but if you'd like to respond to that. And then a related set of questions is, to what extent has the sociology of culture as a discipline helped or hurt thinking around the culture of poverty myth? So it's a great reflexive question. What, if anything, needs to change in research at the intersection of culture, anti-Blackness, and race to better the discipline? So I'll open it up. You can pick what to respond to. And yeah, I'll have it open, whoever wants to speak first.
I'll jump in, and because I don't want to be the last person to speak. So, the way I approach this work is, as I was just kind of saying, this picks up from the last answer. I try to situate any conversation about meaning making and cultural construction and frames within a structural narrative. Like, I try to be aware, not necessarily the political implications, but like actually what I'm seeing. So this has been really important in my policing work. When I interview people and they say things like, I just want the police to show up, and I would like the police to respond more aggressively, like if someone steals something from me. Like, those types of, like, you can take that and you can interpret it in through a cultural lens that is decontextualized and have really just like an inaccurate understanding of the claim. So that's what I try to do, is like, even as cultural sociologists, we need to actually attend to culture. And then I'm going to stop there just because of time, but there's a lot more to say. Those are fantastic questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can jump. Okay, I'll jump in. Yeah, I guess I would just say my own work, thinking about sort of how racialized populations understand or make sense of their social world in France, and the sort of reverberations or relevance of that globally. I'm also always trying to pay attention to sort of their kind of the cultural meanings that they're making, but also sort of the broader structural context, which is, as I mentioned earlier, French republicanism, which makes discussions of race and ethnicity illegitimate or illegible, right? And so the ways in which people are talking about race and racism outside of explicitly using those terms, and that only can happen, or that often happens, in a place where you can't freely talk about racism. So trying to bringing those things together in the ethnography and the ethnographic work.
And I'll just briefly add that I think one of the most important things for sociologists to do, for scholars of any sort that are approaching the cultural terrain, is to be explicit about the political, the intellectual challenges of making whatever claims one is making. So the politics won't disappear from just simply going about the work, but being forward about the risks, the challenges, the concerns, the history of the conversation that already indicts many Black folks around culture. And at least that helps, make vivid why you embrace and pursue a cultural agenda. The other quick point I want to make, and it ties into this, but it is direct reference to a question about respectability politics and the culture of poverty. And I've come quite recently to think of respectability politics as a failed effort to simply stay on the terrain of culture in trying to advance better understandings of African Americans, right? I mean, this post-Obama moment is a moment where we've seen what was supposed to be the success pattern that people talked about from my childhood in the 70s up until the presidency. You've got a bad experience as a youth, you've done the wrong things, straighten up, get it together, do the right things. Well, there's that story, right? And as respectable as this gentleman might have been, the attacks were not simply about policy. They were indictments of character. Huge indictments of character. Just disagree with the policy if you disagree. But that to me spells a failed project around trying to use the culture of respectability to somehow circumvent the consequences of a culture of poverty thesis, and now that bears upon Black life.
Thank you. That was actually the next question I had wanted to direct, was the relationship between the culture of poverty thesis and respectability politics. So I'd like to open that to Jean or Monica to also respond to, and the related part of the second part of the question was, how do we understand this relationship in our current national or comparative context? I mean, I think that was brilliant, what you said, Al, about just divorcing the structure, right, from that context. But I think we have time for that, and then we'll have to close.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in, not on the comparative part, but on the respectability politics and cultural part of the conversation. So I really appreciated what Al said about respectability politics being a failed effort to intervene on culture. But one thing that's really important to also note is that respectability politics has been intrinsically bound up with our efforts to make structural change and to make institutional change, right? So if we think about the classic Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin story, it's like Claudette Colvin couldn't be the face of the civil rights movement. It actually, like, respectability politics is a special case of culture of poverty that influences how we advocate in a structural context and influences structural outcomes. So actually, I just think, yeah, so the integration of those is key. And of course, yes, the politics of the cultural poverty myth, we see this even in very old sociology. If I reread E. Franklin Frazier, you see this, like, these bits of notions of respectability and culture. And so at any rate, I'm going to stop there, but that's a fantastic question.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly jump in to say that I would think about, thinking about the comparative context and thinking about respectability outside of the US, I'm really urged to think about sort of notions of sort of deservingness and undeservingness when it comes to sort of migrants and citizens and questions of sort of national societal belonging, which are, true in France, but also true in Europe and, arguably globally, right? And so I think that's also a way of thinking about, particularly in the European context, the ways in which, migrants, descendants of migrants have to sort of follow all the quote unquote rules to be seen as fully French, as fully German, et cetera, and the ways in which, because they're racial and ethnic minorities, that's always thwarted for them, right? So that's just another sort of broader way of thinking about how respectability plays out here.
Thank you so much. This has been just wonderful. What a wonderful conversation. So we are over time by 2 minutes. I don't know if Hannah or any of the organizers would like to say anything, but on my part, thank you so much for everyone who attended. Thank you especially to the organizers and to these brilliant minds who shared their insights. It was really wonderful.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you all for attending. And I just wanted to say that was a really amazing discussion. I really appreciate it. Stay tuned for our next Culture and Contemporary Life series panel, which is Vaccinations in the Age of COVID, on March 11th at 4 p.m. Eastern. The speakers will be Jennifer Reich, Claire Laurier-Decatow, and Laura Mamo, with Margarita Raisberg moderating the discussion. Thank you all.